Hello, everyone. This is another episode of the SLTD Going Over Big Time podcast. This is the Cantastic. I'm once again joined by Mike, and we are here to do a bit of a different episode today. We are going to review the latest Netflix documentary entitled Mr. McMahon. This is the one that had everybody had been waiting for to drop. Uh, it became available about in last week or so, and I watched it at least twice. Um, to be honest, I was just watching it the second time just to refresh myself on some of the things that were said, some of the wackier things that were said. Uh, yeah. So, Mike, this documentary had been a long time coming. You and I both watched the Dark Side of the Ring series. A number of those episodes sort of center around McMahon. Obviously, from the episode famously about the steroid trials, where they interviewed his lawyer, but there was also a number of other stories that were a little bit more that cut a little more deeper, like the Jimmy Snuka's girlfriend uh, death, allegation of something happened there, and maybe McMahon had covered it up somehow, stuff like that. I feel like this episode sort of like tried to it wasn't trying to, but it kind of plugged a couple of holes from all those like documentaries that were made from Dark Side. But then this was highly anticipated in terms of just we finally got to see Vince McMahon sitting down for like a long term interview. Uh, Mind you, these interviews were conducted before the initial allegations that surfaced in June of 2022. That time, Miss Vince McMahon had initially stepped away from WWE and left Stephanie and Nick Khan in charge, and then and then he subsequently coming back in 2023 to initiate the sale of WWE to Endeavor Corporation. Um, and then by the time of he completely left WWE and TKO Group entirely in January of this year. Yeah, so all this whole documentary was interviews conducted between I think at least the majority of 2021, as far as I could tell, and maybe perhaps early 2022. It interviewed everybody from Vince's immediate family: Linda, Shane, Stephanie, Triple H. Some of the more biggest talent names in terms of for Vince, including Hulk Hogan, obviously, Shawn Michaels, Bret Hart, The Undertaker, Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock. Interviewed some of the executives closest to Vince McMahon, Bruce Pritchard for one, um, and obviously some of the more infamous wrestling journalists like a Dave Meltzer. Um, Yeah, very. I felt it was as in depth as it could have gotten with Vince McMahon, right? Because like Vince's early upbringing, as it was described, very mysterious. Nobody really knows Vince McMahon's early life except Vince, and from what you
Hmm.
could tell, it was he didn't meet his actual father until he was like 12 years old. So,
Yeah.
and it wasn't exactly a loving relationship. I think I'm trying to remember if it was Tanner or you or somebody else that said, "You mean all this could have been avoided if Vince got more hugs when he was a child?" So it's like
I mean,
I don't
that's
know.
usually that's so my initial thoughts going in was that they're not really going to tell us anything that we don't already know.
Hmm.
And that's kind of what happened. I mean, majority of the stuff that was said, if you are a wrestling fan, you knew already. Um but I I mean, I enjoyed it for what it was. And I initially thought it was going to be more of a puff piece that centered around trying to make him seem more relatable. And I don't think that was the case at all. Um, I think that it was evident to me that as you pointed out, this documentary started filming way before the allegations were surfaced, and they started filming this in 2021. And that's kind of where most of Vince's initial interviews were filmed. And over time, they just added more stuff from other people throughout the last 3 years. But as soon as the allegations came out, I think they pivoted and tried to create a new narrative of Vince McMahon is not like other people, and other people are not like Vince McMahon, and that is evident by the things that he made his employees do,
Yeah,
male or female.
yeah, there were several examples of that. In terms of making Vince more relatable, I'm not sure that was the intent, but I thought this was as good as any sort of in-depth look into how the man's mind worked. And I would say for the most part, it was nothing that I wouldn't have thought that was surprising. I mean, the man basically lived for the WWF, WWE. I mean, the company wasn't initially his, but then he bought it out from his father, and then kind of like you can whatever feelings we have about him because of the allegations or for the sort of this very controversially the dehumanizing things he may have done with his employees on screen or off screen. The man did take this company and kind of revolutionized wrestling to its more modern context. Um, and I have to say this: if it wasn't Vince that got the idea, it would have been one of the other territorial promoters that would have eventually picked up on it, like a
Mm-hmm.
Vern Gagne, Eddie Graham. If Eddie Graham didn't kill himself, Jim
Sure,
Crockett, one of
sure.
those guys would have picked up on this on the idea of like nationalizing their product and just taking over everybody else.
Yeah,
Um,
it's hard to say because a lot of those guys were very, uh, to excuse the pun, territorial, and it was kind of like, why would we risk doing that if we're okay with what we're doing, kind of thing. I think Vince was the only person, because from what I can gather, and I think this is something that a lot of people can probably put together based on like just things that Vince has said outside of this documentary in the past about how he always wanted to be in entertainment and that he hated the word wrestling.
hmm.
I think that more of those, a lot of the other territory promoters were the opposite. And I'm not so sure that a Vern Gagne, especially, or like an Eddie Graham, or a Jim Crockett, or any name that you could think of, would have wanted to go in the direction that Vince eventually went.
Yeah, I would say. I mean, that's a good point. I think those guys were more of a older school, geared towards like presenting pro wrestling as pro wrestling. They were of Vince McMahon senior generation.
Yes.
Vince Vince McMahon, the guy we know, is I guess more modern looking, and at least he had a big star that fought the same way. It was Hulk Hogan. Um, I would say what I found interesting was the one point where, and I'm just comparing this to episode from the what that documentary called Tales of the Territories, the one that did
Mm-hmm.
the episode on the AWA.
Mm-hmm.
In that episode, they talked about how Hogan was like in AWA, and then Vince kind of like stole him from AWA into the WWF. But then the McMahon documentary, it was actually Hogan who was actually initially in the WWF, but he wanted to like do movies or go to Hollywood,
Yes.
and
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 Vince,
and
Vince's
Vince tried
dad,
to. Oh yeah, and Vince's dad
Vince's
was like,
dad
no.
Vince's
yeah,
dad was not on board with
no,
his talent going into other ventures.
right. And then so he then left AWA, and then when Vince Jr. took over, he was like, okay, yeah, look, man, I'm gonna do this thing. I'm gonna take it national, and he's like, oh yeah, I'm on board, man. So I guess that
Yeah.
was the one. So one interesting difference in telling of that story. And so it wasn't like as though Hogan was like kind of poached from AWA. I mean, Hogan was
Well,
initially kind of with
initially,
WWF to begin with, to be honest.
I think initially he was, because he was trained by AWA, and
Mm,
then went to WWF, and then went back because uh because Vince Senior let him go because he wanted to do Rocky 3. So
yeah,
but yeah, I mean, there was a lot of talk in the initial like episodes about how Vince always wanted to find his guy, and that Bob Backlund wasn't his guy because Bob Backlund was bland. Bob Backlund to him didn't have the character that could carry a business to where Vince wanted to take it. And because it was the period that it was and it was so old school, it didn't make sense to have a face versus face match at the time.
right. You
That's
need,
why
yeah,
that's why Iron Sheik became the champion at all, because it just so happened to coincide with the fact that he represented a country that we were not friends with,
right.
Americans.
I mean that kind of stuff is I mean it's the same old trope, the evil foreigner, they always
Well, yeah, and they had a
portray that.
section on that too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I mean, foreigners are in America like post World War II were always portrayed, even during World War II, especially, were portrayed in a very negative light. You got your, like for example, I remember like an old movie like Breakfast at Tiffany's. I think the Asian character in that movie was portrayed by Mickey Rooney, a not not a non-Asian person.
Not an
So
Asian.
yeah, I mean, I obviously know about the sort of stereotypes about Asian people, and but yeah, it's the Iron Sheik. This was during the early '80s when Iran just became a sort of an enemy of the United States, and they kind of played off on that, and McMahon. I just find it ironic that McMahon was always talk about how you gotta, you know, make sure your show reflects the popular culture, but then it's like the way we watched the WWE in the final years of McMahon's tenure there, it's like I'm not sure how connected Vince was to modern culture when he just kept churning out very bad storylines.
Yeah.
But he really like touched a nerve during the early '90s with turning Sergeant Slaughter heel and then making him become an Iraqi sympathizer just when the United States went to war with Iraq, and they're talking about like Hogan was talking about how Sarge was getting death threats at his house, and they're threatening to kill his wife and kids, and you're like, okay, so. And then McMahon saying, "Okay, yeah, we learned a lesson. Don't go there when it's that sensitive." But then, like I remember, early 2005, or early 2000s, they bring in characters like the La Resistance, the French tag team, because at that time, the United
Well,
States and
I
France were
mean,
having bad relations, and
even
then Mohammed
1990s.
Hassan, yeah, Mohammed Hassan was probably the last really icky example of that. Like a
Yeah,
guy who was a Muslim, and then they did a bit
but
on
it,
stage with the ring with the Undertaker
I
getting
mean,
kidnapped by
even
terrorists.
even in like 1997, they were portraying Bret Hart as
Yeah. Oh yeah, I remember that.
they were portraying Bret Hart like this, obviously this Canadian hero who didn't want to wrestle anywhere but Canada. And Shawn Michaels would take it upon himself to, at every possible chance, to take shots at Canada. And it's like, Canada, the US and Canada have never been rivals. Like, why are you doing this? Like,
I remember like being in like grade 8 or 7, and like my teacher talk about America, and I was like muttering under my breath, like, "Oh, Americans suck." That's how deep it went. That's how deep that stuff
Yeah.
went in like, when I was in
Yeah,
school
and
watching that.
obviously they took it a step further, and it's like, oh, Brett is only a babyface in Canada, and he's a heel everywhere else, and like, so that's always been a thing in wrestling. I kind of like that we're shying away from that now because it just doesn't make sense. Like, it's okay to feel that way about certain things, but like we don't need to have Samoans pretending to be Japanese and uh
When there's like an abundant amount number of Japanese wrestlers you can bring on. And
yeah, and
yeah.
we don't need to be feuding with somebody just because they're not from America. And it's
You
like,
know what's funny? The last storyline, remember they did, and it's not even in WWE. It was in AEW when Cody Rhodes was fighting Anthony Ogogo, and it was like they made it some big rah rah
uh
USA thing. It's just
and
like
the problem was that it felt like that was like Cody doing that and nobody else. That was the problem with that one.
right.
Because we were sick of that stuff. Why are we doing this fighting for America crap in whatever year, 2024 now?
Yeah.
And so I understand why they touched on that in the Vince doc, because obviously Vince and his old school ways
Hmm.
of like with with the likes of like Iron Sheik and Nikolai Volkov
Hmm.
and Ivan Koloff and all these people that have come through his company, or at the time his territory, and that was just the thing to do. But yeah, I mean, and they also touched on well, not touched on, they spent like a whole episode talking about legal issues
Right.
um even before the stuff that's going on now.
Yeah, even before
And
like Hogan left, because like his Hulkamania was kind of fading by the early '90s, and I think actually Hogan retired at that point, saying he wasn't going to go to another
yeah,
company,
he was
and
gonna act. He was gonna
he was
act
going to
for a time.
act, and the stuff he was doing was just like yeah, and
Yeah.
yeah, then they touched on WCW, which I guess I found a little bit surprising because they do it
Well,
like I'm not I
how
guess I
many?
wasn't that surprised they had to mention it, but they actually did a
Yeah,
pretty extensive enough of an
they
analysis.
did a good job touching on it, because I think they were fully aware that most people know that story forwards and backwards at this point. So, I mean, again, there's a lot of stuff for people that aren't wrestling fans. They probably don't know that much, but the majority of your audience that's watching this is wrestling fans.
That's
So I
true.
think they are probably well aware of the fact that those wrestling fans know this story, like it's been shoved down our throats for 20 plus years, because
Hmm.
Vince just would not let that go. Like, to the point where he was like still like bitter about WCW and wouldn't let Sting beat Triple H. Like, you know, um,
But surprisingly, in the film, he's not portrayed feeling like that. He's like, if it's good business, then he'll do it. Like that's why he like brings back guys that like left him to go to WCW. That's why he brings back people that sued him for like defamation or like
oh, of course.
testified against him in court for the steroid stuff. And it's like,
And this is the part of the documentary, like, of course, there's going to be rewritten history with this kind of stuff. They're not going to talk about how Vince is had like off-screen feuds with like a lot of his talent. I mean, they're going to talk about like the ones that we know about, like Steve Austin when he like walked out and stuff like that, because they turned that into an angle.
yeah, I mean, they did
And
briefly bring that up. I mean, they also kind of like washed over the fact that Steve Austin came up with his character almost on his own. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, they remember. I remember him showing clips of Steve in the ECW where he was like, he looked like he was that ringmaster guy that when he first came in, but he was drinking beer. So he was already initially doing some of
Yeah.
the Stone Cold character in ECW, but they completely washed over the fact that when Vince brought him into WWF, it was like, oh yeah, I want you to be the ringmaster. You're going to be managed by Ted DiBiase, and you're going to be the $1 million
Yeah.
champion, and you're going to just be like a generic
Well,
work.
well, of course, they're not going to acknowledge all of Vince's bad ideas. Why would they do that? It's a
I
documentary.
mean, they
About
mentioned all the other stuff like Mantar and Doink the Clown, and I mean, what?
Well, yes,
That
in
was
the
like the
but
lull of creativity.
that's kind of like that's kind of the go-to, like, oh, we're talking about how WCW took over, so we got to talk about how WCW was not being cartoonish like WWE was, because every gimmick had to be an occupation or uh you know something stupid like a man bull.
Yeah,
And
or a guy popping out of an egg dressed as a turkey.
yeah,
Yeah,
but yeah, I think that they spent enough time. I don't think they wanted to spend too much time on particular things because those things don't really have anything to do with Vince. Like
yeah.
like we again, wrestling fans are going to know the story of Steve Austin and how he
Mhm.
became to be Steve Austin.
Yeah,
But if somebody else wants to know, there's other mediums to do that.
yeah. I mean, WWE does like regular A&E documentary biographies on like a number of like big names, like Bret Hart, Steve Austin, The Rock, whatever.
Yeah.
Um, but back to this documentary, I guess the part where they talk about how Vince came up with the Attitude Era was basically him copying what WCW was doing and just like
And ECW.
tweaking it. Yeah, and ECW what they were doing, and it's just tweaking it to a WWF audience. But you're looking at it, I'm like, I mean, they just pretty much cranked up the ECW product and just, I mean, they toned it down a little,
Well,
but then they just enhanced it in other ways here, and it was
and they
just like,
also did not mention that Howard Finkel was the person who came up with the term WrestleMania. They
oh,
made it they made it seem like it was Vince's idea, because I believe they originally wanted to call it like the Colossal Tussle or something,
the colossal tussle.
and I believe that was the name that they used. But again, they didn't talk about that either. They talked about how WrestleMania was the initial idea and that it was Vince's idea. That's not true. So
Well, I guess the fans who really know, they would know.
yeah, and of course they had to talk about Pat Patterson a little,
Yeah.
and I don't like that they do these kinds of things where they bring this stuff up after somebody has passed on. I mean, yes, there was allegations back then, but that was never proven on his side. So I don't know why we're
And I
still
don't know, but
talking about
yeah, I
that.
mean, I don't know, like the way they. Now that I think about it, I mean, although they went out of their way to say that Pat was not involved in that kind of stuff, he may have been accused, but he had to go away for a bit because in the '80s, being a gay man, it's like there's a big stigma around that, right? He couldn't have just.
Yes.
They would, regardless of like what the findings were, they would have just assumed that they would just assume that, oh yeah, that big old gay Pat Patterson, of course he was touching those guys, and why not?
I mean, and
And
Tony
the way
Atlas.
Tony Atlas explained it, it was like, of course he was. It's just like, yeah, because he's a booker. What am I gonna do? Tell
I
Vince
mean,
you
what
fire
what
me before you fire him?
what was going on with Tony Atlas in this documentary? Because there was multiple times where he was like defending Vince and then defending friends of Vince, but then he just full out goes like, "Oh yeah, Pat Patterson touched me down there." Like, what? What?
I don't know.
Oh, and apparently
Yeah.
he did that to everybody, according to Tony Atlas.
Oh yeah, Pat Patterson. The Pat Patterson. He was just going around touching people's penises and just like, oh yeah, hey brother, how's it going down there? You make it sound like, yeah, it was. You're thinking he just kind of threw that out there. Yo, yeah, he touched my pecker, and I'm like, what? And then like, wait a minute. If he's touching your pecker, like, are you telling me that
Yeah.
he's touching everybody's pecker?
Yeah,
it's
that just was
like,
a
I don't
very
know.
odd.
Yeah,
Why did we include that? Why was that in there at all? Like,
yeah, that was like when they were, and then Bruce Pritchard talked about it a bit, and then it was like, Vince off
well,
his,
yes,
Vince and
and
Bruce and Tony, and I'm like, this seems a bit off considering Pat can't really be here to defend himself. That's
now going off of that, there was an episode dedicated to not only Vince's kids, but the weird things that he tried to get them to do.
well, yeah, I don't even know how to begin on this one. Like, I mean, Shane. I mean, Shane
So,
is in it. So Shane McMahon
well,
is
most of
in.
the episode,
So, yeah.
let me just
Okay,
add. So, most of the episode is talking about how Shane always felt like he had to do whatever he could to make his dad proud of him, which is very similar to what Vince did with his dad.
hmm
And um, he never felt like his dad actually did appreciate him and appreciated what he did for him. And Shane even said that the only time he ever felt like his dad ever actually felt thankful for him was when he jumped off the Hell in the Cell.
But
Like,
that took what, like 30, 46 years after he was born.
so it's like that was the one time that he showed that he cared. And obviously everybody goes back to that meme of how Vince on Twitter wished John Cena a happy birthday and like oh the greatest world champion in the history of
Right.
blah blah blah.
Yeah.
And then next to that is happy
Happy
birthday,
birthday,
Shane.
Shane McMahon. That's it.
Like I mean I understand being tough on your kids, but like this
Yeah.
just I and
That point, yeah, that they try to make that point. They were like Shane and Stephanie, they were treated much harder than almost anybody else. They because they had to work for it. They didn't. He didn't want nepotism. He didn't be like, oh, because they're McFinn's kids, they're gonna have it easy. No, they worked their ass off. Like they
yeah,
started selling merch. They were like cleaning, putting the rings. They went from putting rings together and like you know
reffing.
reffing, backstage stuff, and then they finally realized, okay, yeah, maybe you can. Hey, Steph, you want to try being an on-screen character? And I'm like, and then they pushed even
Yeah.
Linda into it, which Linda didn't even want to
Yeah.
be on screen.
Linda said she never wanted to be on screen
Mm-hmm.
and that she never felt comfortable being on screen. And you could tell that by
Yeah, yeah.
every time she picked up a mic. Literally every
I
time.
remember. Yeah, some of the delivery was very
Um
weak.
but of course they touched on that storyline that we've all heard rumors of, and Vince acknowledged it and said that it was his idea, that he wanted to do an incest angle with Stephanie. And Stephanie immediately turned it down. He even wanted to make money off of her actual wedding. He wanted
Yeah,
to.
yeah. That was crazy. That when they were talking about how Triple H and Stephanie
We're getting married
became
for
a
real.
couple, and then
Yeah.
it was like Vince was the one who didn't want his daughter dating like talent, and then ironically he's the one who pushed her into a relationship with Paul Levesque at Triple H, and then
Yeah.
Triple H is like, yeah, I think Vince wanted to make our wedding into a pay-per-view event, and I'm like, you mean like a wrestling wedding, which is scripted? I'm like, what are we talking
Yeah.
about? It's like, I mean, subsequently speaking, they did do like several other scripted
Well,
weddings
of
with,
course, Stephanie
right?
had
There
like
was like,
3 televised weddings.
yeah,
So, I mean, but yeah,
oh man, two of them were at the same time in the same segment.
yes.
But
But
yeah,
yeah,
it's
and I
like,
mean, there was a lot that episode in particular was just a lot of uncomfortable, like Vince doesn't treat his children like other people treat his children, like, or treat their children in general. Like, and he clearly treats Stephanie, puts Stephanie on a pedestal, and doesn't put Shane on the same pedestal.
Yeah, I mean, to look into their inter-family dynamics a little bit, I think Stephanie, from the way she has run as run business as an executive to, I guess, from that, it seems like she's more similar to Vince
Yeah.
than Shane, because it mentioned how Shane's sort of like a bit of an outsider. He does this kind of things off like a bit over the lines. To the point where he left for a while and like kind of did
Well,
his own
yeah,
thing,
and
because him and his dad were clashing.
they touched on Shane wanting to
Yeah,
buy UFC,
yeah.
and
So that
Shane wanted to use that as a stepping stone to prove that he deserved to inherit the business one day.
I feel
And
like I feel like that idea was like a foreshadowing for what eventually happened, is that both WWE and UFC became part of one
yeah,
company,
but
and it
but
was
but
not
if
the
you
way
think about
Shane
that,
intended, but I think
but
it's
if you think about that from a long-term perspective, at the time when UFC was up for sale, it was not popular. And it became popular right around that time. And Vince could have had that already under his umbrella
mm,
and been making even more money, because again they talked about all his other business ventures that didn't work out,
yeah,
like the World Body Building Federation
yeah,
and the XFL, which we
hmm
all are aware of because he
hmm
tried to do that again and failed. But that the second time obviously was COVID,
yeah,
and but the first time it just ended miserably.
right, because the
And
football sucked, and the fluid content, as Bob Costas would say, was just not fitting into that
yes,
medium. And so the World Bodybuilding Federation, I feel like that was bad timing. That happened right around when they started
steroid trial.
investigating all the steroid trials and all the steroid stuff. So it was just
Yeah.
really bad timing. Um,
Yeah, so you would think about that long term. Like if WWE had bought UFC instead of Dana White, or the team that Dana White was a part of,
yeah.
um, it would be completely different. Obviously, because I mean, UFC now feels more like wrestling. It's just not scripted. You have the lavish entrances and
hmm
guys cutting promos and Colby Covington pretending that he is a heel at all times and supporting Trump no matter what he does. And and now UFC and WWE are under the same umbrella. So you got guys coming out. I mean, Colby Covington's been coming out to Kurt Angle's theme song even before the merger. But Michael Page came out to Undertaker's theme song once and did like a whole Undertaker tribute entrance. Um, so now that those two are on this under the same umbrella, now it's crazy that that's happening and Vince is not involved at all. But
It's
he
crazy
could have
ironic.
been.
Yeah.
He could have
Yeah.
been,
Yeah.
and that's the thing. So yeah, the stuff with Shane just felt like it could have been avoided, and if he had just tried to help Shane get to where he wanted to be, like his dad did for him, like because his dad didn't want him to own the business either.
Well, you don't. I mean, that story that Paul Heyman was remembering about the time when he and Shane were arguing about something really intense, and Shane wanted to go one way, his Vince completely disagreed. Did not want to have anything to do with it at all. And Vince literally, I mean, as Paul Heyman explains it, Vince literally said, "You're gonna have to kill me to get this done." And then he was eating, so he took the knife in hand and gave it to Shane. He said, "Yeah, right here, just do
Yeah,
it right now." And it's like, okay, I know it's Paul Heyman, so I feel like he was selling a little bit, and like maybe this is a bit of an exaggeration to what really
but it
happened.
also wouldn't surprise me.
No, that's the whole theme of this documentary, is that like some of this stuff is shocking but not surprising, especially when you get to the latter part in the final episode. But It's
Yeah.
like treating his kids like, I mean, he wasn't like abusing his kids, but he was like, really hard on his children, and the stuff he would make the wrestlers do, like the fact that Hogan like literally came out and said, "Yo, yeah, I just whatever Vince told me to say, I would say it." I was just like, "You mean you didn't have an original idea in your head about how you
Oh.
wanted one of the what your whole reason for being? You're Hulk Hogan. You're like one of the most recognizable people in the world, and
Mhm.
you don't have an original
I
thought in your
bet
head.
I bet it
Even
was
saying your prayers and eating your vitamins, that was a Vince line. You telling me?
I bet it was Hulk Hogan's idea to call Yokozuna a Jap because he did that on TV.
Well, I mean, it, one thing that was not touched on was later on when I think I don't know if you mentioned it, was like, didn't Vince McMahon use the N word one time right by Booker T, and they totally completely ignored
Yep.
that, and they're like,
Yes.
oh yeah,
And he said it to John Cena, a not black person.
oh man,
But and
yeah,
they talked about a lot of stuff that just was off. It was just like, and they talked about how they brought Sable back, and Stephanie even acknowledged on TV that she tried to sue the company, and that she sued the company over sexual harassment. And then they just brought her back in to
like, oh
play a
yeah, come on back in,
character.
Sable, because
And
Vince,
then Vince brought her back in to literally play his mistress.
Well, remember what like Vince said. Okay, I'm jumping ahead here, but it was like in the last episode, and he was like, I guess the interviewer was asking, "What are you thinking right now?" And then Vince is like, "I can't really say it out loud, but it involves sex." And
Yeah.
like, I guess this dude, in a sense, is thinking about sex a very long majority of the time, because like he's pretty much surrounded by it in
Mm-hmm.
the way he like produced this product. And
Yes.
I mean, even in the beginning when this documentary started, they said Vince was saying, "Oh man, all the stories I can tell you, I can't really tell you." And turns out he can't, because like some of the stuff that came out later,
Yes.
yeah, you really can't say it out
And
loud.
of course they also touched on the allegations of the referee in the 80s,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Um,
which got thrown under the bus, just
right.
got thrown under the rug. I mean,
Yeah.
because that didn't matter in whatever year that was, 1983, I think.
Mm.
And I believe they touch on Jimmy Snuka a little.
A little bit. They mentioned
Yeah,
that, yeah, Jimmy Snuka had yeah, that was the point when they were talking about how like the WWF like was in like kind of like experiencing a number of issues. The steroid abuse and trial,
hmm
Jimmy Snuka's, the untimely death of his
legal issues.
legal issues, the Rita Chatterton thing, and
Yes,
uh,
Chris
God knows what.
Benoit.
Yeah, I'm talking about in the early '90s, but then they jumped to Chris.
Yes,
They also went back to
they
Chris Benoit after like 16 plus years of you know
yes, and
relatively.
they also touched on the Sam Mushnick stuff
Oh,
and
Phil Mushnick, yeah, he's the guy.
Phil Mushnick.
Yeah, so
Sorry.
he was writing a lot about. I guess he was the only one who was writing like I guess dirt pieces, or
Yeah.
that I'm not sure what to say about
Ye-
that on wrestling at the time, because nobody was really doing that. Um.
Yes, and the Doctor D incident.
Oh yeah, they
Uh,
briefly brought that up. Yeah,
and the thing that I think they didn't acknowledge in Dark Side of the Ring when they spoke about this was they talked about how the locker room and Vince loved that.
yeah,
But Dr. D, David Schultz, still got punished because it was a bad look.
right. They
And
realized, oh, we could get sued for this, and we might lose like future advertisers,
yeah,
that sort of thing,
and
because
they never brought
WrestleMania
him
is about.
and they never brought him back. They never brought him back. When there has been other issues legally with other people where they were like, "All right, we got to let you go for a period, but don't worry, we'll bring you back." They didn't do that with him. And But yes, even before we talk about how they acknowledged the Benoit stuff, they talked about Owen Hart a lot. It was part of like one whole, almost a whole episode, and they talked about how Vince discussed about why he didn't stop the show, and
Yeah.
he acknowledged that he probably wouldn't have stopped the show even if that happened to him. Like because he would know that whoever was running the show, if that happened to him, wouldn't want them to stop the show.
That I had to say that sounded pretty messed up.
Of
If it was
course.
like Shane, like they do the thing about Shane years later jumping off Hell in a Cell and like talk about how Vince was, you know, so worried about his only son being in the match. But then they're like this. Well, when Owen Hart's, some of his blood was still in the ring, and they're like continuing with this pay per view, and
Yeah.
it's like that's. And then I watched Jeff Jarrett having to cut a promo. Yeah, Owen Hart, we're praying for you, and then has go right back to attacking Val Venus, and it's just like that's like the mindset you have to put yourself in to do that. It's like what?
Yeah.
Um,
So the one thing I'm surprised they didn't talk about was Brian Pillman, because uh,
yeah,
they didn't talk about Brian Pillman at all, and of course there's that famous interview that they conducted with Brian Pillman's wife
yeah,
days after he died, which is one of the most disgusting things they've ever done on television, because you could tell
yeah,
how
yeah.
uncomfortable it was for her, and it's like they these are the types of things that Vince just did and thought they were okay because it was good for business, or
Yeah,
it
like I'm stunned that they didn't talk. They didn't ask Vince. Like, at what point did you think having Brian Pillman pull out a gun and threatening to shoot on one of your talent
well,
was a
and
good
they
idea?
even acknowledged that he cut a promo or something, or did an interview talking about how they don't do that stuff, and then they cut to all the times they actually did that stuff. Every single thing that was listed, they were
To
like,
even
"Oh,
to even they, I mean they talked up more about Vince saying, "Hey, what if you guys kill me? Like, what if you like I go into a limo and then you blow up the limo, and then we'll
yeah."
pretend that I died."
Well, of course,
More than
that
they spent
was
talking about, "Oh, hey, what if you just put a guy on with a gun?"
yeah, but of course that was led into the Chris Benoit
Yeah,
stuff,
yeah,
because that storyline was halted because of the Chris Benoit stuff,
exactly.
and they talked about how it became a whole big thing talking about um, drug use in wrestling and chair shots and everything. And the one thing that I did not think I would have to like talk about at all was Steve Austin said in his interview during this segment that he does not believe that CTE is real.
Ye- that was hard to swallow as a Steve Austin fan.
Yeah,
That you don't that
that
okay.
was crazy.
So they're talking about in the context of okay, Benoit does the diving headbutt as a signature. Did the diving headbutt as a signature
Everybody who's
move.
done the diving headbutt has had physical issues. Every
But
single
they
person.
almost like whitewashed it. It's like everybody they said, look, if you're doing that, you know that's working, right? And then Hogan's like, oh, if it's like a wrist lock. You like it's like ah, okay, that's working. But like that's not the same as like flying off 6 feet in the air and landing on your
No.
face. Now, I think they do say that okay, yeah, that's supposed to you're not actually supposed to hit your head, but it's hard to control the velocity of your body when
And
gravity
then
takes over.
while
So
talking about this, they cut to almost every single time that Chris Benoit hit his head. And
and oh, by the way, they don't even include the times that Benoit took chair shots in the head. God knows how many times, right?
yeah, no, it was just doing simple moves where he hit his head on the ground. And of course, it was discussed later on when they did the autopsy that Chris Benoit had the brain of an 80-year-old man from all the
Yeah, like
damage that
Chris
he took.
Nowinski, the neuroscientist, former wrestler, that said, "Yeah, I looked at his brain. He literally does have CTE. Like,
Yeah.
the evidence is
Like
clearly there."
literally like Steve Austin said what he said, which again I do not agree with. I love Steve Austin, but there is scientific proof that CTE is a thing. So Steve Austin says the thing that he says, and then they immediately cut to Chris Nowinski, who's like, "Yeah, that's not true. I've seen the scans."
I'm pretty sure that was deliberate somehow, and just
Yes.
putting those two clips side by side. But like, yeah, I don't know. Like, okay, yeah, if you're supposed, I think they just basically stopped doing that move as a regular thing post Chris Benoit
Well,
because it's just.
I have gone
I
on.
mean, Chris Benoit was warned by the Dynamite Kid, "Do not do this move; you'll cripple yourself." And I think Dynamite Kid was warned by Harley Race, "Don't do this move; you'll end up
Yeah,
killing yourself." Like,
I have gone on record as to say that I think that the diving headbutt is one of the most devastating moves in all of wrestling, and that it should be banned everywhere. And I fully believe that, and I still believe that to this day. I cringe every time somebody does it because I know the effects that it causes, and just the fact that and this is relevant. Bryan Danielson has neck issues, and he still does the move. Like, that's crazy.
yeah, it's I mean, it's like, I don't know, it's like one of those moves that I think you really have to just keep it in your back pocket and just and look, I'm just speaking as a fan, but I think you and I are just speaking as fans. I think like moves like that involve like your head
Yeah.
touching a hard surface of some
Yeah.
kind, you really just want to keep in your back pocket and don't want to like
Yes.
make it a regular thing. I mean,
So of
it's funny, like you
course,
talk about. It's funny how you talk about, oh, there's no CTE, doesn't exist, and then they show clips later on of Shane McMahon's head literally bouncing off the concrete floor because Kurt Angle couldn't figure out how to throw him through the glass properly.
well, no, I mean,
And you're like,
that was not Kurt Angle's fault. That was
huh?
that was production's fault because they used the wrong glass.
Yeah, but it's like the risk of like people hitting their heads is always going to be there,
Yes.
especially when you do high
So
impact
of
stuff.
course they used all of this
Uh-huh.
to talk about how Vince went out on television and talked about his attempted storyline about him, quote unquote, dying, and how Donald Trump thought that he died for real and called to make sure Vince was okay.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And and then to discuss the fact that they did a tribute show for Chris Benoit, not knowing the severity of the situation, and that obviously Vince regrets doing that, but it was very and of course they cut to the interview that Vince later that year where I forget who it was. I don't think this was the Costas interview. This was a different
No.
interview where the guy was talking about how all these people died and
Yeah, yeah.
thought that Vince should take some responsibility, and Vince refused to do that.
Yeah, they showed several interviews where Vince is on mainstream television, like with Bob
And
Costas or
going
with
off
this
the
guy.
handle.
Yeah, acting like Mr. McMahon and not Vince. And it's like, I don't know, like I don't I mean,
And
they
I
showed
think there
that
was
and they
one occasion where they showed clips of these interviews where Vince acknowledged, like, "Oh, I probably should have handled that better."
yeah, in
But
hindsight.
yeah,
But like,
um, yeah, a lot of that, a lot of like, oh, Vince goes off the handle a lot in interviews. There's not really anything that can be done about that.
it's so interesting because I mean, like one of the themes is through this whole thing is, is Vince real or is Mr. McMahon, the way he acts on TV, is that the real guy? Or is it a combination of the two and it's just the lines are really
Mm-hmm.
blurred? Like you
Yes,
think about the Trish Stratus segments, barking like a
yes,
dog. beating up Stephanie, basically
Choking her with a pipe.
choking her with a pipe, drugging your wife Linda, and the stuff with
Yeah.
Sable and like Stacy Keebler and all this other shit.
And of course, Vince tried to do what Vince does and say like, oh well, this stuff might not be right for this time, but at that time it was stuff that was getting over, and it was stuff that was getting me heat. And when Linda finally popped out of that chair, it was one of the biggest pops in the world, and that's why we did that. And like, sure, that's fine, but you acknowledged on television and said numerous times that you were blatantly drugging your wife so you could cheat on her.
Yeah, so the pop when Linda kicked him in the nuts, that was great TV. But it's like all the stuff that leading up to that built towards that moment was just like,
and
I wouldn't do that again.
And of course, they used all of this as a basis to acknowledge the current situation. And Trish Stratus said that it was fine because it was storyline stuff. And I don't believe her. Which it is what it is. She's going to say what she thinks she needs to say on camera, I guess. That's for her, I guess. I don't know. And as you mentioned, they asked pretty much the majority of the people they interviewed are Vince McMahon and Mr. McMahon the same person? And is there a difference? Or in the majority of the people were like, Mr. McMahon is just Vince McMahon dialed up to 1,000, like, because that's who the best characters are in wrestling, and that's what Steve Austin said. That's what The Rock said. That's what Triple H said. And then you had some people, I believe, Tony Atlas, or there was a couple of people who were like, Mr. McMahon and Vince McMahon are clearly the same person. It's very obvious. Like. It goes back
to like how I think even Vince in this doc acknowledged that I don't really know who Vince McMahon really is, sometimes.
Yeah.
Because it's like, is it me, Vince? Or is it just the guy that's on TV? Or is the guy on TV real? And me, Vince, is just the show that I'm putting on for everybody.
And Triple H. Yeah. And Triple H said that Vince only lets certain people see the real him, and that not a lot of people actually really know the real Vince, and he's going to show you what he wants to show you, because that's just the kind of person he is. And I don't know. I have a hard time believing that I have a hard time believing that Vince didn't let his ego of his character become the way he was all the time. Because obviously we've heard stories, if you listen to podcasts of certain people that work for him, and they even acknowledged this in the documentary, that Bruce Pritchard got yelled at like all the time off screen, like Mr. McMahon would at people on TV. So was he really playing a character, or was he just acting like himself on TV? Because if he treats his employees that way, who's to say he isn't like that all the time? And of course, the entire documentary was sprinkled in until the final episode. They sprinkled in all this acknowledgement of what's going on now. And they even said in the very first episode that the majority of this was filmed before the allegations arose. And after the documentary came out, Vince McMahon wrote a statement. The first thing he posted on Twitter in like months. And I have the statement up, so I'm going to read it. He says, I don't regret participating in the Netflix documentary. The producers had an opportunity to tell an objective story about my life and the incredible business I built, which were equally filled with excitement, drama, fun, and a fair amount of controversy and life lessons. Unfortunately, based on an early partial cut, I've seen this doc falls short and takes the predictable path of conflating the Mr. McMahon character with my true self, Vince. The title and promos alone make that evident. A lot has been misrepresented or left out entirely in an effort to leave viewers intentionally confused. The producers are typically editing use typic the producers use typical editing tricks without uh without
Out
of
of
con-
context footage.
without of context footage and dated sound bites, etc., to distort the viewer's perception and support a deceptive narrative in an attempt to further their misleading account. The producers use a lawsuit based on an affair I ended as evidence that I am, in fact, Mr. McMahon. I hope the viewer will keep an open mind and remember that there are two sides to every story. Now, when you look at that and you really analyze it based on everything that he said, those are things that he did all the time.
You mean taking footage and editing it out of context to make us look like something else?
Yes.
I mean, the infamous Kevin Dunn camera cuts are like still fresh in my memory. So it's like,
Yes, but also the revisionist history stuff and trying to create a narrative. Those are things that he did all
yeah,
the
that's a good point.
time.
That's the wrestling business. That's what he made. That's how he made WWF successful.
So
It's like,
how can you even use that as an argument when you are guilty of doing that? And I mean, they even, as we mentioned earlier, acknowledged in the documentary. And I don't know if Vince.
I mean, by the way, this statement came out before the documentary dropped, so before we all see it, so he already knew
Yeah.
that. I mean, so he obviously knew that how it was going to be portrayed, and it's like he had seen it and thought about it, and like, oh yeah, there's no double standard here. It's like
Yeah,
this is
and
this isn't what I did.
and as we talked about earlier, they did that cut of how Vince did that interview saying that he didn't do this and didn't do that, and then they showed examples of everything that he said he didn't do that he actually did do. This is another example of that. He is saying that he didn't do these things when it's very evident that he did. And I think it's further evidence that there is no difference between Vince McMahon and Mr. McMahon because he's lying in that statement already because he does those things. He does those things that he's accusing the documentary people of doing. So you would have to be stupid not to realize that. Like, there's no way he doesn't realize that. And if he does, it's just because if he doesn't, it's just because he's really old. There's no other logical explanation. Because, again, another thing that they touched on in the documentary that Vince acknowledged that they did all the time was create things that create their own narrative. When they talked about Hogan and Andre, they talked about how they had faced each other a bunch,
Right,
and
right. Hogan
Andre
slammed the whole jury a bunch of times already, but it didn't
exactly.
happen on their show, so they need to
Yes, it did.
make it as though, yeah, and it actually did, but people just don't remember it. So we have to make this whole thing because we need to sell WrestleMania 3.
Yeah. So, but
So
how are
let's
we
make
gonna?
it a thing where, and by
So
that
how are
time,
we gonna
yeah,
sell WrestleMania 3 if Andre's already been beaten or if Andre's already been slammed? So let's just tell everybody that neither of those things have happened. It's the same thing. He did this all the time, taking out details about certain things and not acknowledging certain aspects of things that happened in his own company on his own television. And now you're going to come out with a statement about a documentary that wants to tell the truth.
Wait,
And
wait.
you're going
So I heard this thing, and I think it's been debunked. But apparently, Vince and Kevin Dunn want to make a separate documentary to debunk this one.
yeah.
I'm not sure
S- s-
how much more they can sugarcoat Vince. I mean, I actually thought this wasn't that bad. I mean,
Supposedly that's not.
you have analyzed much more than I did, but I'm like, this is as close as we're gonna get to a unvarnished analyst of Vince and from Vince himself. So I don't know
Yeah.
how else you're gonna.
Apparently that report is not true.
Okay, that's
Um,
fine. If it, I would, but
um,
here's the thing: I wouldn't be surprised if it was true at this point,
yeah.
because things. I mean, just like you said, this is an old man that what he's now 79 years old. Like he said before, he in the doc he would never retire. Because when you're retired, you just stop moving and you stop living. You might as well just go die. It's like one of his old sayings in a promo: "Life sucks and then you die." I mean, so might as well like make the best of it. I wouldn't be surprised if he like decided to do another thing and like try to you know get himself back in the game, so to speak, right? And
Uh huh.
I mean, some of these other things that I don't know. The one thing I remember was the promo where I'm trying to remember. I can't remember in what context this was, but he just randomly shouting, "Come on out, you rapist!" like he
Yeah.
just, that was. I'm pretty sure the inclusion of that clip was no accident.
Of course not.
It was just
Eh,
like the things this man has said in on TV. It's like so much of it has just turned into real life. It's just mind-boggling to me sometimes. It really.
Yeah, and that is a big thing that they. I guess they kind of semi acknowledged because Vince, of course, did not do another interview with the documentary people when his allegations came out, and they, he didn't come back to say anything about it. Obviously, probably because he couldn't. But um, yeah, there was just a lot of like, oh, I never did that, but very clearly you did, kind of stuff. Um, so yeah, I just think that this documentary did what it was supposed to do, and I think the initial, obviously before the current allegations came out, I think this was just supposed to be a career retrospective. But I think that the people who made this documentary were well aware that it would not come off very well if they just stayed the course and didn't acknowledge that this documentary was done before the allegations and that they had to do something to acknowledge the allegations, because if they didn't, it would just come off as
Right.
it would not be a good look.
Yeah,
It
it would have left a big hole of unanswered questions.
Yeah, because if they would have if they would have did nothing, then it would come off more as a puff piece, because all you're doing at that point is inflating the man's ego, and he certainly doesn't need that. So I think that it was the right move, obviously, for everybody to be well aware that, like, yes, this is a career retrospective of one of the biggest names, promoters, minds in wrestling, but also people like him with power and money aren't perfect, and nobody's perfect in general, but just because they have power and money doesn't mean that they haven't done bad things.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
Vince has a laundry list.
yep. And yeah, this documentary really shines a light on some of that. I mean, there was a lot of like there may have been some missing parts to it, but overall, probably the best summation or deep dive into Vince McMahon's life and the way his mind worked, the way how basically his life is WWE and how he took that from just a small regional territory, made it into this global powerhouse, and along the way just had some good ideas, but then like had a ton of also terrible ideas that yeah, I think a lot of people probably wanted to say more on that didn't get the chance to in this one. Um,
Yeah, I mean, there was some people that I was surprised weren't interviewed. Um, but everybody that was interviewed, I think, I mean, Triple H, The Rock, Steve Austin, Hulk Hogan, all of those people are going to just try to be positive in every way.
yeah.
And John Cena, of course, John Cena will talk about like, oh, there would be no John Cena without Mr. McMahon, and
I mean, you bring up all that talent. One other thing that they all commonly said in the closing part was he's like a father figure to me, or he's like my father. He's like a father. I never really
yes,
knew my own father. He was more. I spent more time with him than my own father.
yeah,
I can understand maybe a small aspect of that was true, but these are the top guys, right? So of course they would have treated him. Vince would have treated them or her a little more generously.
yeah.
Pretty sure there's hundreds and thousands of people that have made their way through the WWE. Some of them probably didn't feel that way, and
Well,
some of
yeah,
them
like
realized it was just a job and it was a business relationship
they
at the end of the day, or whatever.
they didn't interview anybody who sued him in that concussion lawsuit. So,
Yeah,
uh, what's Raven think of this documentary?
everybody got that sued McMahon obviously was not on the documentary, or anybody who was part of any sort of class action lawsuit was not interviewed. Um, I'm surprised they didn't interview Vince McMahon's lawyer, Jerry McDivitt, because he did it. He
Yeah,
did it outside the
I
ring.
I was also surprised there was no Jesse Ventura.
Yeah, I mean,
That
when
was
it comes to the whole unionization attempt in the '80s, that was
yes, and they talked about that, and they
and
talked about
Jesse
how
Ventura loves to talk, right? He's a
and
talker.
they talked about how Hulk Hogan was the reason that didn't happen.
It's just like you just like get Hogan to say a bunch of shit, and we know the trend lately. Like Hogan can say like he was abducted by aliens and then he took over the planet of Mars for like 5 years or something, and that we just supposed to take that as fact. Like, oh yeah, brother, I was the one who stopped Jesse from causing too much trouble. I'm like, would have helped if you got a statement from Jesse Ventura or something, right?
Yeah, so I would say that there's obviously it's a fine documentary for what it was meant to be. If I would say that it's worth watching, because if you don't know anything about wrestling, I mean, if you're listening or watching this, you probably are a wrestling fan, so either way. But um, for people who don't know too much about wrestling, I think it would be a cool thing to watch to learn those things. But for people like us who are big wrestling fans and watch a lot of wrestling and pretty much know everything that they talked about because it's been told to us so many times, there wasn't really a lot in this documentary that was new to me. There wasn't anything that I learned that I didn't know. Um, they just shined more of a light on those things and were more candid about them, which is something that Vince never did. Ever. Vince hasn't talked about Benoit in since
Yeah,
2007.
yeah. This was the first time he even had to talk about that.
He hasn't talked about Owen in 25 years. You know, like that. I think that is for wrestling fans what they will take away from this the most is that he's acknowledging some things that he wouldn't acknowledge for years because they were just not allowed to be talked about on WWE television. And he's being candid about some of them, and other ones he's just blatantly lying, which is not surprising. And if you are a wrestling fan, you can point out where he's blatantly lying a lot because you know, and you know better.
Yeah. Anyway, I think we should wrap it up because we've pretty much talked about all we can about this documentary. Again, this is Mr. McMahon on Netflix, streaming on Netflix now. If you're interested, go check it out. I mean, if you want to watch a wrestling documentary, you might not know too much background information. Well, I also recommend the Queen of Villains, which is a biopic about the female Japanese wrestler Dump Matsumoto, who was apparently just a terrifying heel wrestler of the 80s and early 90s in all Japan. Some people might find that more appealing than listening to 5-6 episodes of Vince talking about himself. So there you go. I put that out there for your consumption. And
yeah, so thank you everybody for watching and listening to this podcast. Go to our linktree / going over big time podcast for all the ways to watch and listen, as well as social medias for us and Tanner and for the podcast itself. And look out for future things that we're working on that we hope to get to do in the future. And that's going to do it for me. Alan, your closing words.
And again, thank you very much for listening. And remember, always watch the wrestling you want to watch, not necessarily what people are telling you to watch. And thank you, and have a good day.